There's a kind of person you've probably met. They don't ask for help, not because they don't need it, but because asking, even when the need is real, feels like something close to failure. They're calm in a crisis, quietly competent, and somehow slightly unreachable. What shaped them wasn't a single moment. It was thousands of ordinary days when nobody came, and that absence, quiet, consistent, unremarkable, became the architecture of an entire psychology. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. They were your older colleague who solves the problem before anyone else realizes there is one. Your parent who shows up when things fall apart, but never quite explains how they knew to come. The person who built the internet and still doesn't post about their lunch. They are, by nearly every measure, the most psychologically overlooked generation alive. And to understand why, you have to go back. By 1984, researchers at the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry estimated that approximately 7 million American children between ages 5 and 13 were regularly home alone after school. 7 million children letting themselves in, making their own snacks, waiting in quiet rooms for adults who were working, who were leaving, who were distracted by their own unraveling lives. Psychologists call this a high-contingency environment. It's a clinical phrase for something deeply human. When you are young and the world does not cushion you, your brain learns fast that you are the cushion. Your nervous system begins to self-regulate early, not because it wants to, because it has to. And here is where the neuroscience matters. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for anticipating consequences, planning ahead, managing uncertainty, it develops in response to demand. Challenge it early, consistently, without a safety net, and it grows sharp. Not invulnerable, but sharp. These children didn't just learn to be alone. They learned to think ahead of aloneness, to scan for risk before it arrived, to read a room the way some people read weather, and then they watched something else happen. Their parents, the generation that swore the rules would hold, quietly broke every one of them. Divorce rates climbed through the 70s and 80s. Companies that demanded loyalty handed out layoffs like afterthoughts. Institutions that asked for trust, Watergate, the AIDS crisis, Iran-Contra, rewarded it with betrayal. Psychologists call the resulting worldview defensive pessimism. But that term doesn't quite capture it. Defensive pessimism is a strategy, a way of mentally rehearsing the worst outcome so that when things go wrong, you're not destroyed by the surprise. For Generation X, this wasn't a strategy they chose. It was a reflex they were trained into. Hope carefully, trust slowly, expect the floor to move. Here is what's important to understand. None of this is damage, or rather, it's not only damage. When researchers study psychological resilience, they consistently find that the capacity to tolerate ambiguity, to function without external validation, to remain steady under pressure. These are not traits that emerge from easy childhoods. They emerge from childhoods where the world required them. Generation X developed what developmental psychologists call autonomous coping mechanisms, not because they were exceptional, but because the environment selected for it. The child who came home to an empty house and fixed their own dinner and figured out why the TV flickered and calculated change at the register before the screen could do it. That child wasn't neglected into helplessness. They were, in a very real neurological sense, trained into competence. And competence, quiet, unsexy, invisible competence, became the identity they carried into adulthood. Not a performance of strength, just strength. There is a paradox at the center of Gen X psychology that most people miss. They are simultaneously the most independent generation and the most quietly collaborative one. Think of it like this. Imagine a person who learned to navigate entirely by internal compass. No GPS, no real-time feedback, no one calling out directions. Just the slow accumulation of landmarks memorized over years. That person becomes extraordinarily capable of finding their own way. But they also become, over time, someone who quietly notices when you are lost and walks with you without making it a moment. This is why Gen X friendships form differently. Researchers in the Journal of Adult Development found that Gen Xers report significantly lower rates of seeking social support during stressful periods, not because their relationships are shallow, but because asking for support triggers a deeply embedded association. To need help is to have failed the self. The brain's threat response system, the amygdala, learned early that vulnerability had costs. And so support became something they gave without drama and received almost never. There's another mechanism worth understanding. Before the internet, information had weight. To know something, you had to earn it. Hours in a library, card catalog drawers, books that might or might not have what you were looking for. Cognitive psychologists call this effortful encoding. When information requires effort to obtain, it integrates more deeply into long-term memory. It becomes less fact and more understanding. Generation X didn't just learn things. They understood them in a way that's difficult to replicate when the answer is always a few seconds away. And then there is irony. Gen X turned irony into a kind of psychological armor. And this is not an accident. Growing up in the shadow of the Cold War, children were taught two contradictory things simultaneously. The world could end at any moment, and you should not worry about it. When the adults in your life hold two catastrophically inconsistent ideas at once, your brain develops what psychologists call cognitive dissonance tolerance, the capacity to exist inside contradiction without being paralyzed by it. Irony is what that looks like on the outside. A joke that acknowledges the darkness without being consumed by it. Distance, not from feeling, but as protection for feeling. So what can the rest of us learn from this? Not to copy the wounds, but to understand the wisdom encoded inside them. The first principle, competence is its own kind of safety. Generation X learned early that they could not control whether the world would hold them, but they could control whether they were worth holding on to. So they invested, relentlessly, in skill. Psychologists call this internal locus of control, the belief that your outcomes are shaped more by your own actions than by external forces. Research consistently links internal locus of control to lower anxiety, greater resilience, and higher life satisfaction, not because it's always accurate, but because it gives the mind a lever, something to do with the fear. The second principle, silence is not absence. Gen X tends to show care through action rather than language. Through showing up quietly, through fixing the thing, through remembering the detail you mentioned once, months ago. This is not emotional unavailability. This is a love language formed before the concept was invented. For those who receive it, and for those who give it, learning to recognize quiet care is as important as any form of emotional literacy. The third principle, expect the floor to move and build accordingly. Defensive pessimism is not the same as hopelessness. Psychologists Norum and Cantor, studying defensive pessimism in the 1980s, found that people who mentally rehearsed negative outcomes were often more effective, not less, because they had already processed the failure and built contingencies around it. The pessimism was functional. It wasn't giving up on the future. It was refusing to be ambushed by it. The fourth principle: depth over visibility. Visual: the ocean surface, still and reflective. Then a cut to the deep, dark water below. In an era of relentless self-broadcasting, there is something quietly radical about a generation that learned early. The less people know about you, the safer you are. Privacy is not secrecy. Depth is not withdrawal. Research in social psychology suggests that people who maintain clearer personal boundaries tend to experience greater psychological coherence. A stronger, more stable sense of self that doesn't reshape itself based on audience. Generation X carries this instinctively. The digital world has tried for decades to convince them that visibility equals value. Most of them remain unconvinced. The fifth principle: bridges don't get applause. Generation X entered the workforce when the old rules were dissolving and the new ones hadn't formed. They navigated the collapse of institutional loyalty, the birth of the internet, the dot-com crash, the 2008 financial crisis, often without a map and almost always without acknowledgement. They became the bridge generation, not the ones who built what came before, not the ones who will inherit what comes next, the ones who held the middle while both sides figured out their footing. Bridges do not ask to be noticed. They ask only to be strong enough for what crosses them. Here is the simplest mental model for everything we've covered. Imagine a tree that grew in difficult conditions, not ideal soil, inconsistent water, exposed to wind from a young age. That tree does not grow tall and symmetrical. It grows deep. Its root system spreads far beneath the surface, wider than you'd expect, more complex, reaching toward resources that easier-grown trees would never have needed to find. And when the storm comes, the tree that grew in difficulty does not bend the least, but it survives, quietly, without needing anyone to see. Generation X is that tree, not because adversity is good, it isn't always, but because what the mind builds in response to difficulty becomes the architecture of who it is. The latchkey children became the quiet leaders. The ones who learned not to ask became the ones everyone turns to. The generation no one talked about became the generation that held things together while everyone else was arguing about who should. If you're Gen X, or if you love someone who is, or if you simply recognize something of yourself in the quiet self-sufficiency this video described, know this: the child who learned to be alone did not become someone who needed to be alone. They became someone who learned to be whole inside themselves, so that when they chose to let someone in, it was a choice, real and deliberate, not desperate. That kind of wholeness is rare, and it took everything that was asked of them to build it. The bridge doesn't need the city to notice it, it just needs to hold, and it does. It always has.